Story 1. The Whispering Walls. When my friend Sarah moved into that old Victorian house, she thought she'd hit the jackpot. The rent was unbelievably cheap for such a spacious place, and the landlord seemed eager to get it off his hands. "It's just been sitting empty for a while," he said, avoiding eye contact. Sarah didn't think much of it at the time. She was too excited about finally having a place of her own. The first few days were uneventful. The house had its quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows, and the occasional odd smell, but nothing out of the ordinary for a century-old home. Then, one night, she heard it. It started as a faint murmur, like someone talking in another room. Sarah paused her TV show and listened. The sound stopped. She shrugged it off, thinking it was her imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the whispers were louder, more distinct. She could almost make out words, but they were just out of reach. Over the next week, the whispers became a constant presence. They followed her from room to room, always just behind her, always just out of sight. She tried to convince herself it was the wind or the pipes, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. One night, Sarah decided to confront the sounds head-on. She grabbed her phone and opened the voice recorder app. She sat in the living room, the whispers swirling around her, and hit record. For 10 minutes, she sat in silence, listening to the eerie murmurs. When she played the recording back, her heart stopped. Amid the static, a man's voice came through loud and clear. "Get out," it said, over and over. The voice was cold, emotionless, and filled with a malice that made Sarah's skin crawl. She played it again, hoping she'd misheard, but the words were unmistakable. The next morning, Sarah called the landlord. At first, he was evasive, but after some pressing, he finally relented. "Look," he said, "the guy who lived there before, he died in the house. They found him in the basement. No one knows how he got down there or what happened to him." Sarah's blood ran cold. She packed her bags that same day and moved out a week later. She never went back to retrieve the rest of her things. To this day, she refuses to talk about what else she might have heard in those walls. But here's the creepiest part. A few months after she moved out, Sarah was going through her old photos and found a picture she'd taken of the living room. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing by the window. Its face was turned toward the camera, and its mouth was open as if it were speaking. Sarah deleted the photo immediately. She says she still hears the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet. Story 2. The Shadow in the Woods. My cousin Jake is the kind of guy who doesn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. He's a practical, no-nonsense kind of person, which is why his story is so unsettling. A few years ago, Jake decided to hike a remote trail in the Pacific Northwest. He'd heard rumors about the area being haunted, but he laughed them off. "Ghosts don't exist," he told me before he left. "It's just a bunch of superstitious nonsense." The hike started off normally. The trail was beautiful, with towering trees and a peaceful silence that Jake found refreshing. But about 2 hours in, something changed. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, suddenly went completely silent. It was as if every living thing had vanished. Jake stopped in his tracks, feeling a chill run down his spine. That's when he saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing between the trees about 50 feet away. It was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and completely black, like a silhouette cut out of the air. At first, Jake thought it was a trick of the light. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Jake's rational mind kicked in. "It's probably just a tree," he muttered to himself. though he knew it wasn't. He decided to keep walking, but the figure reappeared. Closer this time, it was still just standing there, motionless, but Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickened his pace. The figure kept appearing, always just ahead of him, always just out of reach. Jake started running, but no matter how fast he went, the shadow stayed with him. It was as if it were toying with him, herding him deeper into the woods. Finally, Jake broke through the trees and stumbled onto the trailhead. He was drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. He jumped into his car and sped away, not looking back. When he got home, Jake did some research and found out that several hikers had reported similar encounters in that area. Some even claimed the shadow followed them home, appearing in their windows at night. Jake hasn't gone hiking since. He says he still feels like he's being watched, even in the safety of his own home. Story 3. The Face in the Window. When I was a kid, my family lived in an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those creaky, drafty houses that seemed to have a personality of its own. My bedroom was on the second floor, and my window overlooked the backyard, which was surrounded by dense woods. I loved that house, but there was one night that changed everything. It was a school night, and I had gone to bed early. I remember falling asleep to the sound of crickets chirping outside my window. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark and the house was silent. Then I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My heart started pounding, and I pulled the covers up to my chin. I told myself it was just a tree branch brushing against the window, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. Finally, I mustered the courage to sit up and look toward the window. The moonlight streaming in cast strange shadows across the room, but I could see the outline of the window clearly. And that's when I saw it. Pressed against the glass was a face. It was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. Its features were distorted, like it wasn't quite human. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stared at it, my mind racing. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the face tilted slightly, as if it was studying me. Its grin widened, and I swear I could hear a faint, guttural laugh. That's when I finally screamed. My parents came running, flipping on the lights as they burst into my room. By the time they got there, the face was gone. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the yard, but he found nothing. No footprints, no ladder, no sign that anyone had been there. It was probably just a nightmare, my mom said, trying to comfort me. But I knew it wasn't. I had been wide awake. For the next few weeks, I refused to sleep in my room. I camped out on the couch in the living room, too scared to go back upstairs. But eventually, my parents convinced me to return to my room. They said I couldn't let my imagination control me. The first few nights were uneventful, and I started to relax. Maybe it had been a nightmare. But then, one night, I woke up again to the sound of tapping. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly turned my head toward the window, and there it was. The same pale face, the same hollow eyes, the same unnerving grin. This time, I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. The face just stared at me, its grin widening as if it knew how terrified I was. Then, slowly, it began to move. It tilted its head to the side, then the other way, like it was mocking me. I don't know how long I lay there staring at it, but eventually, I must have passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through the window and the face was gone. I told my parents what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was having nightmares or sleepwalking, but I knew what I had seen. A few years later, after we had moved out of the house, I found out something that made my blood run cold. My dad was talking to one of our old neighbors, and he mentioned the farmhouse. The neighbor's face went pale. "You didn't know?" he said. "That house has a history. The family who lived there before you." They said they saw things too. Faces in the windows, shadows in the yard. They thought the house was being watched by something or someone. I never found out what the face was or why it had chosen me. But to this day, I can't look at a window at night without feeling a chill run down my spine. I always keep the curtains closed just in case. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear the tapping. Tap, tap, tap.